Hey, everybody. Thanks for being here as usual. Just following up, welcome to Zoom lecture number 4. Thanks for being here as usual. Stein, Picasso, Cubism, etc. Just kind of getting set up here. Excuse me. I have to apologize in advance. My neighbors, who we have a great relationship with, very close, just over there. They're having a new bathroom installed, so we have a couple more hours of plumbers and contractors working outside. So I appreciate your indulgence if we have any noise. Well, we left off last time. We were talking about coming full circle back to the Cubists and as well as Cézanne and Matisse. And we talked about their art as an attempt at a new accuracy, one more adequately representative of the way human consciousness experiences and inspects the world, one more adequately representative of the I as well as the I, right? The I as well as the I, subjectivity engaged in the human act of seeing and being. Well, notice one of the chief goals, we're moving towards Stein here, right? And I know you finished your early reading. Good job. Moving towards Stein here. One of the chief goals of realist painting, you think of that Vermeer that we talked about last time, was what you can think of as quote unquote transparency, right? In other words, in other words, the goal was to produce an as clear as possible rendering, as lucid as possible a rendering of the illusion of reality, with all traces of constructedness, all traces of artifice, all traces of the presence of the artist concealed or removed or judiciously avoided, right? And that's what made a great realist painting. That is, the craft of realist art lay in the elegance of the execution of this concealment, right? So the idea was to produce an image of the real, an image of quote unquote reality, so clear, so lucid, it was like you're looking through a window, a Windexed window into the real, right? And that's what that realist picture plane is, right? That realist picture plane is think of that Vermeer. It's an absolutely beautifully limpid transmission, as it were, of the real. It's like looking through a transparent window, right? So the artist's hand, and by extension, the artist's subjectivity. In other words, literally the hand of the artist as the person, as the the body part putting those strokes to canvas, right? And by extension, sort of metonymically, by extension, the artist's subjectivity, the actual, you have the physical presence of the artist as well as the subjective presence of the artist concealed as well. Now, Cubism and modernist painting generally flies in the face of this realist devotion to transparency in representation and transparency in execution. Let me just read that again, it's important. Modernist painting generally, Cubism in particular, flies in the face of this realist devotion to transparency in representation, transparency in execution. So transparency in representation, transparency in execution. Think of what might be the literary implications or the literary analogies to those values. In other words, what I'm saying is, think of what Stein is learning by looking at these Cubist paintings, by speaking to Picasso on those long Saturday walks between Le Bateau Lavoir and 27 Rue de Fleurus, right? And think of what all the American artists, the British artists, the artists throughout Europe traveling to Paris at in the crucible of the modernist moment, right? Think of what all those artists, think of how all those artists were conceiving of their own work, their own moves as literary artists, as they beheld these paintings that were shattering so much of artistic convention in very exciting ways, right? Which I've introduced you to. Okay, so you've seen in your early reading, when you read A Gentilina, Stein exhibits a similar defiance, doesn't she, of literary realism's devotion to transparency in representation. Here's what I mean by this. Rather than conceal her presence as the author, she asserts her presence as author via any number of stylistic techniques. Let me just list them here, but we're going to go over them later, right? This defiance of the conventions of literary representation can be, let's admit it, very annoying. She's very difficult to read for us. Why? Because she's disrupting the expectations that we bring to the table as readers of conventionally realist texts. And it can be annoying. Her work challenges and indeed defeats our conventional expectations as readers. Here's the list, right? Expectations in the area of structure. Yeah? Think of the way that story, Gentilina, is structured. Expectations in the area of syntax, the way sentences are put together. Expectations in the area of diction, her notions about word choice, when to repeat a word, when not to repeat a word, what words to use. Expectations regarding character development, expectations regarding episodic rhythm, expectations regarding narrative trajectory, the arc that she sends her characters on, the arc of crisis and denouement, right? Denouement here, the sort of a fancy French term, but a very useful one for us. A denouement is simply the way the arc of trajectory ends up, the denouement. So you have that initial, you have the initial introduction, and then you have the narrative building to a crisis, and then the crisis resolves into denouement, right? Incidentally, follows a very male idea of essentially male sexual experience. That is introduction, crisis, denouement. Whereas Stein is more interested in an episodic rhythm and a narrative trajectory that's very, very much more feminine, very much more fluid, very much more gentle, very much more graceful. It's a sense of rhythm modeled not on male patriarchal sexual experience, that play of crisis and resolution, right? But on female sexual experience. As a gay woman encountering these new modes of artistic expression on the wall in front of her, you can see how this work was generated by the collision of those two, what should we call them? Those two sets of values countervailing to the conventional sets, right? Fascinating. Okay, so that's just a touching base with Stein. So remember, I'm gonna go through now the case of the Cubists, right? So we'll be talking about Picasso, George Braque, and Juan Gris. But let's always remember what we're after here is that linkage to literary implication. And of course, I'll allude to that throughout today's talk. Okay. Okay, so let me bring up let me bring up our PowerPoint here. So we see here in Cubism, let me just go through what I have on the slide here. An evolving mode of representation, an evolving mode of expression, a new way of seeing. So let's look at a comparative series here. We're going to compare photographic reality, right? Photographs, and then look at Renoir's rendering of photographic reality and Cézanne's rendering of photographic reality, and then Picasso's rendering of photographic reality, right? And then we'll look at some further comparisons. Okay, take a quick drink. This is Ambroise Vollard, right? Ambroise Vollard, 1909. Vollard was a really important, I've mentioned his name before, really important exponent of the modernist art scene. He was a gallery owner. And that's what he looked like. And you can see the great Cézanne behind him, right? So this is 1909, Vollard. This is Renoir in 1908, portrait of Vollard. And you can see Renoir, obviously, as always, as a kind of, as heavily influenced by the Impressionists, as many consider him to be an Impressionist as well. His use of colors is very striking, and you see that back wall is fairly flat. Maybe it was flat, but you can see, very clearly there's a depth of field here. One shoulder is closer than the other. The far shoulder is in shadow. The near shoulder is toward us. The edge of the table recedes. So we're looking clearly into a three-dimensional space, right? And you can see the shadowing on Vollard's head it gives you the very clear idea that this is a three-dimensional subject, right? There's also a very clear distinction here between the subject, the figure, and the ground, right? The painting is about Vollard, in other words. Okay. This is Vollard in 1899, earlier picture, pardon me, by Cézanne. And again, very clearly representational. Now you can see those kind of fauve touches coming in here. See the little green on his forehead. We don't have patches of green on our forehead that I know of, right? A patch of this grayish color, another patch of green on the forehead, a little mauve down here. I'm not so good with naming colors, so some of you will have to help me, right? So yes, it gestures toward the representational. You can clearly see, this is a figure. The painting is about the figure, not about the ground. Also, look at the brush strokes emerging here. You can see what we talked about as transparency. Think of Vermeer. That Vermeerian transparency is beginning to recede here. The artist's presence is being asserted in the strokes of the brush. Again, think of the literary analogies, and we'll get there. Good. This is Picasso in 1907. So this was painted at the same time that Stein was writing Three Lives, right? The Gentilina. And so you can see, wow, big difference. It's a different mode of seeing, implying a different mode of experiencing the real. You can see there's some gestures. You can see that there's a man there, right, or a human being, I should say. You can see the mouth. You can see the nose, although the nose seems to be a little fractured, possibly pointing in different directions. We're seeing it from different angles. We see the two eyes, but the two eyes seem to be being viewed from different angles and possibly at different times because they're not colored exactly the same way. You can see this complex forehead made up of what I'm going to allude to this later, but you can think of as planes of interest, P-L-A-N-E-S, planes of interest, right? As if applied to the canvas as separate units. There's a certain, you remember I was talking earlier about the materiality, the plasticity of this work, right? Um, I'll talk about that later as well. There's almost a tactile quality. It's almost sculptural, isn't it? These different planes that seem to have been applied and seem to have accrued on the subject's person, right? I mean, it's like a painting that's being sculpted and being sculpted at different times of at different times of day, um, uh, uh, from different angles with different materials, as if to say, this is what I see, and this is what human beings really are. We can't experience human beings in a single lucid, transparent snapshot. Our vision of them is more complex, impacted as it is by our subjectivity. They themselves, as subjects, are more complex than our reductive attempts to depict them transparently, as if transparency was even possible when it comes to depicting, understanding a human being. You see? Let's look at some more Cubist portraits, or Cubist portraits. So there's Kahnweiler, another very important gallery owner. Okay, so you see what he looks like in a photograph, right? There's what he looks like in a Cubist portrait, 1910. Okay. I mean, you can imagine people viewing this Cubist art for the first time in galleries, even people really interested in art. It just must have been confounding and frankly annoying. And I'll be honest, you know, that little touch of annoyance that you felt when you're reading the Gentle Lena, when you're starting into the second story, you know, when you're starting into Guanana, that little jolt of annoyance that says, she's not playing by the rules, Stein. This is annoying. This is difficult to read. Right? We'll talk more about that. It must be exactly what people must have thought when they were looking at portraits like this. And you can see again, just like in the Villard portrait, there's clearly hair here, but it seems to have been applied at different times using different materials on different days. Even it doesn't even look like the same hair. And you see, you know, there's the nose, and here are the two gestures toward two eyes, but they're not pictorial at all. You know, they're not transparent at all. They seem to be almost sculptural gestures toward the mask of a face. The hint of an ear here, right? There's the smile, or is it a mustache? Is two halves of a mustache? Gesture toward another ear over here. Folded, I love these folded hands in the middle. So you see the cut of the lapel here, but again, that the lapel is broken into different planes of interest, as if the edge of the lapel ended at different times, depending on what day you were looking at the lapel and in what light you were looking at the lapel. But you know what? That's what happens. That's real. That's accurate. In that it embraces the complexities, the nuances of human sight and human understanding, and I think most crucially, human being understood. The complexity of human character, the unknowability, the unknowability of human character, as opposed to the realist presumption that human character not only can be known, but then can be rendered, can be depicted, can be narrativized, thinking of literary art, right? Can be narrativized in a story, can be developed in a character. You know, you want to say, give me a break. You can't develop character. You barely understand what character is. So complex it is. I'm playing devil's advocate here, right? I love beautifully developed character, a la Dickens, a la Austen, a la George Eliot, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. You see the gold watch and the fob, right? The chain from which the watch hangs, the shirt. You see the hint of a collar here, and the hint of a tie knot and the tie, and then the vague shape of the suit, of the jacket, and so on, right? But notice too, wow, where does this figure end? And where does the ground begin? And isn't it true? I mean, there's a difference in shading here, right? You can tell there's the kind of shadow of a line here. What this line has to do with this part of, Conrailer's head, I don't know. I mean, it becomes a shoulder line here, but what is it here? Is it ground or is it figure? You see what I'm saying? Is it of marginal importance visually and conceptually? Or is it of primary importance visually and conceptually? And by extension, y'all, what do we marginalize? And what do we include? Paintings like this forcing us to examine those dimensions of our human knowing, of human consciousness. Could you imagine the debates they would have had in the coffee houses? Can you imagine the tweets that would have been going back and forth? The Instagram posts. Okay, there's Marcel Humbert. She's a later mistress of Picasso. Great dog, huh? Okay, get a sense of what she looked like. There she is again. (1911). And there's the portrait, 1911. I mean, this portrait and this painting executed in the same year. Notice the dynamism of a work like this, these picture planes playing off against one another. And notice, it seems to me, you see what you think about this, y'all, but what it seems to me, what this painting is provoking us to do is to find the subject. Who is she? Where is she? What of her is available to me? What of her resists interpretation, remaining mysterious? I don't want to narrativize it too much. But the painting, am I right? The painting does seem to be, in part, about the hermeneutic act, the act of trying to make sense of our world. And this is an element of our world, as, God help us, our characters are, that resists interpretation, that resists easy, pellucid, transparent representation, and that can only, in its complexity, be accurately presented, not represented. And while we're at it, playing devil's advocate here, don't give me the dishonesty of the erasure of the artist in transparency. Foreground the artist, because it is the artist that's performing an act of interpretation and an act of representation. So to efface that via craft is a kind of lie. And it's a kind of honesty to admit it in the work. That's pretty good. Cool, huh? Okay. And there's Fernande Olivier. You recognize her. And there's a sculpture of Fernande Olivier. I wanted to pick a sculpture because I wanted to give you a sense for, I wanted to give you a sense of the materiality, the substantive quality of up to this point, painterly elements, or elements of construction, the material elements out of which a work of art is built, whether it's on canvas, because paint is material, isn't it? Whether it's on canvas or whether it's more solid and more clearly three-dimensional, right? But just notice again, the picture planes at work. In this case, I don't want to call them picture planes, but they're literally sculptural plane, like literally material planes, right? Applied, that accrue into a work of art. So it's almost as though you're looking at a figure that is in process, visually, and by extension, that is in process subjectively. And isn't it true? Aren't we all in process visually as we move through the world, through its light, through its wind, through its weather, through its time? And we are also in process subjectively as we move through the world and its pressures and its hopes and its desires and its dreams and its disappointments. You see? And how do we represent that in a visual art? How do we represent that in a literary art? This is what Stein is after. This is what Picasso's after. 1907, Head of a Sleeping Woman. See the continuing influence of the, I'm actually teaching in my daughter's ballet studio on the edge, it's one end of our house. We turned our nice enclosed, used to be a screen porch, into a sunroom. And we just lost one of the mirrors that my daughter depends upon. Okay. Dance of the Veils. Notice how the forms of the ground and the forms of the figure absolutely echo one another and absolutely contextualize one another. And the literal marginal in the painting, you can feel emerging as almost equally central to the figure. Certainly contextualizing the figure in a way that's in a way that inflects the figure very, very powerfully. Girl with a Mandolin. More clearly representational, right? But again, you can see the divagations from representational accuracy all over. See the shoulder here and the shoulder here, not on the same plane. It's as if the face, what is this? Is that a downcast eye? Where's the other one? Is this the edge of the hair? But it seems then that the hair is fading into the ground, right? The hair of the figure is fading into the ground. Okay. Notice nearly totally abstract. Head. A little bit later. And you have to ask yourself, what is the effect of a work like this? And I believe this is a combination, I forget what they're called, combination of art and sculpture, right? Man, man. So the cap, little square head, gesture of a nose, gesture of a mouth, gesture of nostrils, maybe a mustache, the ear. But yeah, what does this say? No idea. Is it a flower in his lapel? And you see the edge of the lapel, just like with conviola. This one's a little more defined, right? It's a little, he looks like a policeman, doesn't he? A little functionary. But I love this work because it really does alternate between the representational, in which you see the man, and the utterly abstract, in which the man becomes a concatenation of geometric figures, most of which are rectilinear or linear, right? It's almost as if it's a man seen from many different angles, in many different lights, a bit of each included and applied in this single portrait. And sort of the two, I love these two somewhat vacuous, empty eyes here, flat, you see, framed by this utterly rectilinear square of a face. You see, and to me, I know we don't want to, we don't want to murder to dissect here. In interpreting this piece, we don't want to make it, we don't want to enervate its power, but it does evoke an emotional response, doesn't it? I think unpredictably, depending on who's looking at it, depending upon what time and what time in their lives they're looking at it, right? And Picasso's playing with all that, right? But the one thing it ain't is transparent. You see? Yet that lack of transparency is expressive of a new way of understanding visual sight, comprehension, consciousness, the relationship between the world and the subject walking through the world. The role of the artist, new way of understanding the role of the artist, which we talked about. Still life with bottle of rum. I like the letters, this newspaper, newsprint, right? Maybe a little, the lip of the bottle, maybe the neck of the bottle, gestured toward the body of the bottle. Where it goes, I don't know. A gesture toward, is there a glass here? Is there an implied glass? You guys can find more in there than I can. Okay, another still life. Well, but what a still life. You see the wallpaper, the edge of the guitar, the shape of the form of the guitar, the music that the guitar might play. It's the newspaper that's lying on the but it's a complete, I think there's something tongue-in-cheek and comical about it as well, right? It's funny, it's playful, it's sort of, you've heard the phrase "épater la bourgeoisie," les bourgeoisie, right? This is a kind of épater, it is a kind of mockery, a kind of annoyance. A mockery of the grand old tradition of the still life, featuring a guitar and a flower and a bottle and a glass and a newspaper on a table, still, always rendered. God, those medieval masters at still lives, it's just extraordinary how beautifully transparent that work is. And then this. And notice too the flatness of it. The violin. You really get a sense for any object is this, I'm paraphrasing, but any object is the sum of our different glimpses of it, right? Because you really can almost each of these planes, right? Each of these planes of interest contains a detail from the violin that's recognizable, right? Almost every frame, even the marginal on the left and the right, they're sort of redolent of the kind of dark, richly varnished, richly stained, old, august, patinated surface of a beautiful violin. Woman in an armchair. Three Musicians, famous painting. The Dream, 1933. Looks like a Matisse, doesn't it? We'll talk more about Matisse. Speaking of, okay. Okay. The Cubists wanted to compress human experience and inspection of the world, which takes time, which is linear, into one moment, one synthesized view. Hence, the different planes of interest presented by a Cubist painting or sculpture. Let me take a drink real quick. What might the literary equivalent of these planes of interest be? Stein's compositional technique presents one possible answer. Those repeated, recursive narrative facets that together accrue, yes, to tell the story of a life, but more accurately, not merely to represent, but to enact that life. In this way, Stein's work is less representational than presentational. It embodies more than it depicts. In the same way that a Picasso picture embodies more than it depicts. And what might be the literary analogy to the Cubist condensation of human experience or time into what I called earlier one synthesized view? In the realm of narrative, right? So this is the literary implication. In the realm of narrative, past becomes present and is rendered presentationally. Past rendered presentationally as present. Past rendered presentationally immediately. Think of Joyce's Ulysses in 1922 and the presence of the past in the present of Leopold Bloom, the central character, as he walks through Dublin, thinking about a future event. We're going to talk about this, this presence of the past in the present, but the presence of the future in the present as well. As we walk as human beings through the present of our own lives, what is in our past and what is in our future makes us who we are now, and now, and now, and now, right? And Joyce explores this beautifully. You'll read Ulysses at some point if you're serious about literature. He's imagining what he knows to be the coming adultery of his wife with somebody named Blazes Boylan. And that's going to be happening later, and he knows he's found out about the tryst they're going to be having, and he also is remembering past events from his past with his wife's name is Molly Bloom, famously. He's remembering events of his past life involving Molly and other events, but he's also navigating the presence, just like Ulysses, just like Odysseus, Homer's Odysseus navigates his present, also imagining a future and remembering a past in his present as he faces Circe, as he faces Calypso, as he faces Scylla and Charybdis, et cetera, et cetera. You see? So you think of Joyce's Ulysses, think of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway or To the Lighthouse, 1925, 1927, respectively. So Joyce, 22, Woolf's Dalloway, 25, To the Lighthouse, 27, Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, jumping up 50 years, 1977. Toni Morrison's, for my money, one of the top 5 works a human being in America has ever produced. Toni Morrison's great, important work, beloved. It's one of those matchless novels like Moby Dick. Or, name your favorites. I've just named several of mine. 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 1967. They went to school on this Cubist idea that the past and the future inflect the present now, inflect instantaneity, the nowness. And how do you write that structurally? Well, your answer is in Joyce, in Woolf, in Marquez, in Morrison, and as we will study, in Faulkner. You read just about anything by Faulkner, but particularly Sound and the Fury. You guys, I've studied Faulkner with a couple of y'all, several of y'all actually, and you can see. You can see the Faulkner embracing these very ideas very, very clearly. In Quentin Compson, the past is present, and the future is present, and the present is profoundly present. And our subjectivity consists in our ability to navigate that collision. That's who we are. Subjectivity is our navigation of the presence of the past and the presence of the future in the present, along with the crises that the present, the crises and the succor that the present offers us. That is who we are. Think of Ezra Pound. Speaking, we'll talk about Pound later in this class. What I'm doing here is introducing you all to all of the ideas that are going to permeate the rest of the semester, right? So this is time well spent. Think of Ezra Pound speaking of the past in terms of cultural history, not psychological history, not personal history like Faulkner and Quentin Compson or Joyce and Ulysses and Leopold Bloom, right? Or Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway. Cultural history, the past as literary history. He said famously, Ezra Pound, all ages are contemporaneous. All ages are contemporaneous. History is now. The future is now. History is currency. What was is now. It's a very Faulknerian idea, isn't it? What was is now. In other words, y'all, the essence of our humanity is unchanged by time. And the best literature speaks to this unchanging humanity across the centuries in both directions. Joyce believed this. That's why he's writing a book called Ulysses in 1922, 2,500 years after Homer walked the earth. Right? But it still resonates. Why? Because all ages are contemporaneous and our humanity persists. We approach it from different directions artistically, but the mythic structures like Homer's, they resonate with us, and the idea is they always will. They'll evolve, right? Ralph Ellison makes use of them in Invisible Man. That's a kind of odyssey. It's an odyssey that he applies to the African-American experience in the middle of the 20th century in America, right? Think of Eliot. He includes structural features and lifts actual lines in the original Italian from Dante's Inferno in his Wasteland, right? Which we'll be reading. You hear the voices of Dante, Baudelaire, Spenser, Chaucer, Shakespeare. They all live in utterly current relevance when we invoke their structures and language in contemporary work. Let me just read that again. They all those authors live in utterly current relevance. They become relevant now when we invoke their structures and their language in contemporary work, when we transform their images, their narratives in contemporary work. They live again. That's what Pound and Eliot meant. All ages are contemporaneous. And think of James Joyce's Stephen Dedalus. He's kind of the other. You have Leopold Bloom, Molly Bloom. The other central character is Dedalus, right? And Stephen Dedalus says, history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awaken. History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awaken. How do I liberate myself from the past, which we can never do, right? Because in a certain sense, we are our pasts, aren't we? I bet you all feel that in your own ways, uniquely, each of you feel the presence of the past, your family's past, your region's past, your nation's past in your own life, right? We are our past. But part of what we do when we're young, particularly, but also I think when we're artists, and this is what Cubism is, this is what Fauvism is, this is what modernism is, an attempt to leave that restrictive history behind or incorporate it, but in a transformed state into new categories of relevance, right? That's what these men and women are doing as writers, as artists. And they do it in different ways. Okay. Well, remember, now we're back to continuing to enumerate the features of modernism in visual art and thinking about their literary implications. These artists also, so secondly, they also sought to enhance the tension between figure and ground. In other words, that I've talked a little bit about this already. They want to challenge the structural bedrock of realist art, to defeat the compositional hierarchy, that is the hierarchy between what's important and what's not, right? What's central and what's marginal, right? To defeat the compositional hierarchy that gave static order to realist artistic expression, right? So here's Matisse, right? It's kind of nice talking with Matisse there. Kind of nice talking over Matisse's shoulder. Let's look at Matisse, 1913. That's what he looked like roughly this time period, right? So he's young. He's a younger man than Cézanne. I believe he's a little older than Picasso, though. Okay, there's a 1903. So this is Picasso. This is Matisse is painting this, pardon me, during Picasso's blue period, and you can see it's painterly in the sense that you can see brush strokes, you can see the antipasto, the thickness of the thickness of the paint. You see the breasts and the mark of the artist's brush strokes, and the stroke under the breast going down toward the navel, and this descending line down the sternum, and the strokes on the thigh, beautifully denoting the reflectivity. And then you see old Matisse in the background, right? So it's clearly a three-dimensional picture plane here, right? The eye is literally, it's carried from you looking at the front of the model to Matisse looking at the front of the model, except you're seeing him in reflected light. So it really is, it's a brilliant way of introducing depth, the illusion of depth, into the picture plane, right? And you can see there's a number of shadows, and you can see, there's light to the right side of the picture and coming in a window, and you see the shadow here. So there you see the shadowing behind the woman's legs and so on. You do get shadow here to the left of the table. You do get a sense of three-dimensional space, right? Let's continue. Here's Matisse. As I was saying before about those portraits of Vollard, and I think I was talking about the Matisse. Faces don't have these big mauve curves on them. You see the yellow under the at the tip of the nose, and the green stripe across the forehead, right? That's not the way human faces look. That's what we call bad painting. Yet it conveys, God help you. You see a face like this in a painting, and you begin to see it. You see those colors in the world in a way that you never saw them before. Your eye is forced to see the visual modalities with which nature presents you in a new way. And after I go to a great art museum, I walk out and I feel like my eyes have been squeegeed clean, and you can see color in a new way, right? You remember Stein saying, "The thing seen at the moment it is seen, the thing seen at the moment that it is seen." That's what she wants to present, right? In other words, the thing seen before our brains tell us what to do with the thing. You see what I'm saying? Pure sight, sight differentiated from the pragmatistic. Yeah, I'm gonna check time. Okay, let's continue. Green stripe, and look at all the issues that that I was just discussing. It's a very, very present, a big green stripe right down the bridge of the nose. And look at the difference between the left side of the face and the right side of the face as we look at the face. Okay, and here's the open window. Now notice the flatness here. That you start, this is clearly, it's a scene outside a window, but this is not representational reality. This is not transparency. This is something very different than how Vermeer would have painted this scene. Imagine the almost photographic clarity of a Vermeer of this scene. And look at this, right? And notice the flatness that emerges. The figure and the ground, it almost, the almost doesn't matter which is which, right? So you begin to understand that there's sort of a tension at work here. Typically, there's a figure and a ground in the background. Which is more valued? Is the central more valuable or the marginal? Well, isn't it true that the marginal is also valued? And simply because you're looking in one direction doesn't mean what you're not seeing in the other direction isn't important, right? Or what your one directionality has made central, what your myopia, right, has made central. That doesn't mean that's any more important than what's on the edges, right? Think of the implications of that socially and politically, right? What your political mind tells you is central ain't necessarily central for everybody, right? And the people that your political mind has been taught are central aren't necessarily central. The marginal are just as important. Well, how does art express that fact? Do you see? Without being programmatic, without being too explicitly political, still being interesting, right? How does narrative art, how does literary art accomplish that, express that, right? Well, Stein is one way. The focus on the marginal without ignoring its marginal status in the hegemonic culture to which it belongs. That's what Stein's investigating in part in 3 Lives, marginal lives. Okay, let's continue. I just want to show you a couple more. Very famous, the dessert, Harmony in Red. Right? And looks completely flat, picture plane. There is no marginal. There is no depth. The table looks like it's on the picture plane, on a 2-dimensional picture plane. But it looks like the table and the picture and the wall are on exactly the same plane, doesn't it? Exactly the same plane as what's not just the window, but what's outside the window. It's all presented as if it were of equal visual importance, right? And by extension, of equal thematic importance, right? Worthy of our focus. Think of what Stein's doing in 3 Lives. Worthy of our focus, despite culturally marginal status. 1908, right? After Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. So you have Picasso painting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon in 07, Stein writing 3 Lives in 07, publishing in 09, and then Matisse painting A Room Like This in 1908. The Red Studio, very famous painting. Same principles at work. The floor and the floor, the far wall, and the wall on the left all appear to be on the same picture plane, 2-dimensional space, right? And there is no object of focus in this painting. Do you see? There's no subject, right? There's nothing that compels our attention. There's nothing that compels our consciousness. Every element, every structural element, every compositional element is equally significant. And I'm tempted to say equally insignificant. So do you see they're playing with artistic convention, guys? Okay, so Let's continue here. Pink Studio, same 1911, same principles at play. It's just like the Red Studio, compositionally, right? And here's the central figure. And guess what the central figure is? A background. You see what he's doing? Playful, but assertive of an idea of reality, an idea of the artist's role with respect to reality. Think of Stein navigating these ideas, right? Okay, let's look at a couple more. Okay, so we're to Stein, Paris, Young, Hemingway. Okay. So thinking about Matisse, thinking about the literary implications of this release that Matisse provides us with, this release from the quote unquote, the figure ground binarism, right? We're released from the figure ground binarism by Matisse, yeah? What are the literary implications of that release? Okay, in the realm of character, we move from the conventional presentation of literary character, which is a literary character as distinct from setting, as autonomous, as independent, as able to act upon the world unilaterally and decisively. We move from that notion of character to the presentation of character as indistinct from the social, indistinct from the psychological conditions surrounding it. Character as ineluctably linked to environment. Think of the gentle Lena, think of the good Hannah. Ineluctably linked to environment through the mere fact of human consciousness. In other words, we are conscious in the world, and therefore we belong to it and it belongs to us, inflecting our subjectivity now by now by now by now. And you think of Clarissa Dalloway and Mrs. Dalloway, think of Leopold Bloom, whom I've talked about, think of Setha in Beloved, think of Quentin Compson, think of especially Benjamin Compson, who's in a certain way, you guys who've read Sound and Fury know this. I've taught it with, I've covered it with several of you. Benjamin Compson is indistinguishable from the world that he moves through. You see? And part of us wants to be condescending and we want to say, oh yeah, Benjamin, something's wrong with him. You know, he's developmentally disabled. Well, okay. Yeah, except, you know, Faulkner is revealing to us an aspect of our own subjectivity in Benjamin. We are Benji, indistinguishable from the conditions into which we're born, the psychological conditions, the social conditions, the material conditions, right? They're in us. Our subjectivity consists in our navigation of them, including the past, including our notions of the future, impacting the present now and now and now and now. Okay, so that's in the realm of character. Think about the literary implication in the realm of plot. So in plot, we move from an organized hierarchy, the realist notion, right? An organized hierarchy in events in which what is conventionally regarded as significant is foregrounded, and what is conventionally regarded as insignificant is made marginal, as is appropriate to the realist imagination, right? But we move from that realist notion of plot to an inversion of this conventional formula in which the conventionally marginal becomes primary. Think of gentle Lena, think of good Anna. Conventionally marginal becomes primary, and the conventionally primary recedes in importance. So the marginal takes center stage, the small looms large, and the insignificant becomes the object, the subject of our attention and our identification, which of course redounds to the conventional notions of character as well as event. The marginal takes center stage, the small looms large. The insignificant becomes both object and subject of our identification. Think of Lena, think of Anna, think of Melanctha, of Stein's three lives as you work through them. So that's plot, that's character. What about the implications of this art in the realm of setting? There are and I'm not going to work through them all, but you can do that for yourself. There's an analogous set of transformations that occur regarding the relation, maybe a better word is the interrelation of setting and plot, as well as setting and character. Good. So continuing to enumerate the features of modernism in visual art with an eye toward literary implication. We've done one, done two, now we're on our third one, right? These are artists sought to offer the image in a different way, the image itself, that literary art as well as visual art, that literary art is built around, right? They sought to offer the image not as mimetic representation, but as presentation. That is, as form with a capital F, as form. Meaningful, yes, but meaningful not as mimetic signifier of a conventionally conceived signified, a conventionally conceived reality, but meaningful in and of itself on its own aesthetic terms, on its own philosophical terms, on its own spiritual terms, terms that are not entirely knowable, terms that resist the dominion of quote unquote reason, the domination of the logos. By logos, some of you who've studied literary theory recognize that term. By logos, I mean the ascendant language and analytic logic of a particular time and place, a particular social, a particular political, a particular cultural hegemony, right? So let me just read that again. The logos, the ascendant language and analytic logic of a particular time and place, a particular social hegemony, a particular political hegemony, a particular cultural hegemony. So they're terms that resist the dominion of reason, the dominion of the logos. They're terms that are, quote unquote, counter-rational. In other words, they don't make sense when we encounter them in their rawness. Think of when you pick up the Gentle Lena for the first time. They don't make sense in the way they're supposed to, but that not making sense is subversive to the sense that a given dominant culture provides for us to locate ourselves with respect to it, right? So in other words, modernist art, modernist sculpture no longer acts as a finger pointing, however elegantly, at the moon. It becomes the moon. Let's read that again, because it's about transparency. Modernist art, modernist sculpture no longer acts as a finger pointing, however elegantly, at the moon. It becomes the moon. And by implication, the role of the modernist artist is no longer that of a priest gesturing, however elegantly, toward the beauty of the creator's world, the creator with a capital C. That artist becomes that creator. Think of Jackson Pollock, the great kind of one of the stars of the New York school of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Abstract expressionist. Think of the way the titles of Jackson Pollock's dynamic abstractions evolved. There's one called Autumn Rhythm. Autumn Rhythm. And you can tell by the title, Autumn Rhythm. It's totally abstract, right? But you can tell by the title, it's still referential. It's still a signifier, right? It's still a finger pointing at the moon. Still a celebration of God's creation, autumn rhythm, right? And there's the title. Painting just as big, painting just as dynamic, painting sort of the same school. The painting's title, Number 5. Aggressively non-representational. This is the moon itself, not the figure pointing at the moon. A celebration of the artist as its creator. So, what's the literary analogy to this movement from representation to presentation? What's the literary analogy to this movement from representation to presentation? I need to stop talking at this point. So let me just draw a line there, and we shall continue where we left off next time. Thanks, y'all.